you probably know, it's a bit of a change for MAPA. We usually do the annual meeting on a Saturday afternoon. So this is an experiment, and we look forward to seeing how it comes out. We really look forward to hearing our two speakers this evening and having some discussion about the ideas that they present to us. And then Brian has the hard job of herding all of our working group presenters and getting people to stop talking after 3 minutes on presenting the work of the working groups. So thank you all for coming. Welcome, welcome. And Jonathan, I'll send it to you.
So, we want to take a moment to, on the other hand, more than 1 million who have been lost to COVID-19, hundreds of thousands of loss of lives in Yemen and Afghanistan, Iraq, and in Ukraine. But actually, we have 3 members of our own family who we lost this year: Jamie Babson, Joan Eckline, the president of WILF, and Marty Nathan. And these 3 were staunch advocates for peace and negotiation and kind of foundations of mass peace action. And so we kind of just have a moment of silence in remembrance of their contributions and all the others we've lost this year. All right, thank you. And Rosemary, give you back the gavel. You're muted.
You're muted, Rosemary.
I'll pass the gavel quickly over to Cole before I get muted again.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. We have a great program lined up for you tonight. It's my privilege to introduce Katrina Vandenheuvel. She is editorial director and publisher of The Nation. She edited the magazine from 1995 to 2019. She writes a weekly column for The Washington Post, including most recently, American media's approach to war coverage needs to be fundamentally reimagined. America's hypocrisy over Ukraine and spheres of influence, and how to avoid a new Cold War and focus on what America really needs. Katrina is a longtime observer of Russia and is president of the Council for U.S.-Russia Accord. Katrina.
Thank you so much, Cole, and thank you for letting me be part of this meeting. I was honored to learn that March 30th, you had a discussion group to discuss my late husband, Stephen Cohen's book, War with Russia, ? War with Russia, ? And we are reissuing the book with a new introduction and comments on the book. We've kept the question mark. We've just called it memorial. We were talking before some of you came on about how eerily, painfully prescient Steve was and how important it is to hear voices like Steve's, I hope like mine. There are others, John Mearsheimer, Chaz Freeman, Richard Sakwa, you've had on a number of good people to talk. But too often in our media in these last, not just months, but years, the perspective of better US-Russian relations has been treated as a subversive idea. And it's gotten, I don't need to tell you, there is anguish as we look at this footage from Ukraine. There's a barbarism. I haven't seen, maybe you have, I've never seen footage like that fill our screen. And I did write last week in the Post, the Washington Post, which is pretty tough ride to be in there because so many, it's 0.75% neocon. But the importance of not just showing Ukraine, but in these last years, we've been at war in Yemen. Think of the battle in Mosul. Afghanistan, we haven't seen Afghanistan except the coverage of the failed withdrawal, as it was put. So I think it's important to rethink. First of all, we should not have war. There should be peace And peace should not be a subversive idea, but if there is war, it should be covered so that millions of Americans don't think it's a video game or a drone pinpoint attacking. I wanted to say what's needed, it seems to me now, and there's news today, just hours ago, that President Biden is open to Ukraine becoming neutral in a final peace deal. There's news that Putin has agreed to the UN help in evacuations from Mariupol's Azovstal plant. I'm sure in this sense we agree. What is so urgent is a ceasefire, urgently needed to stop the bloodshed, to stop and move towards some kind of negotiated resolution. Someone I've been working with at the Nation and at the Quincy Institute, Anatol Levin, has written in these last days that 90% of an agreement is there to be had. But as you well know, it's much harder to start a war than end a war. And you've, I'm sure, followed what's on offer in a sense. It's shifted somewhat, but essentially what was on offer in 2014, the Minsk Accords, is not far from what could be negotiated today. A free and independent sovereign Ukraine, neutrality, security not via NATO, but via a range of countries, no NATO, put off NATO, and the language rights for minorities in Donbass, where troops would leave the country, Russian troops leave Ukraine. And that's been on offer basically since 2014, and it was Germany, France, Ukraine, Russia. The problem then, as it is now, there are two central problems. The United States, and this is a US proxy Russia-NATO war. I mean, let's just not beat around it. It began as a Ukraine civil war in so many ways, really a civil war, which isn't to undermine Ukraine as a whole and independent sovereign country, but it's been divided in many ways over the years. And Steve and I have had so many friends in Russia whose great aunt, whose grandmother, whose uncle were Ukrainian. The interrelationships are so key. But in 2014, neither side was prepared, and that fell apart. What's also, and this is a very serious issue, there are neo-right, neo-extremist, neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine who were in the Rada, the parliament. And certainly when Zelensky was elected years later as a peace candidate, he was elected as a peace candidate. The forces that were in such dominance in the Rada put in the constitution that they had to join NATO and wouldn't permit Zelensky to undertake what he was trying to. So he is a very courageous figure. But I say this with respect for him. It's not fully clear how much latitude he has in these negotiations. And I think what's key for us is that the United States, and this seems distant as we talk, play a role in pushing for some kind of negotiated resolution. But we're sending massive amounts of weapons. I mean, you know that. I mean, it's 3.5 billion, and that's just public. And the danger there is that as the war widens and expands, if it does, the danger of nuclear accidents increases. And the talk of degrading or weakening Russia, I'll come back to that. But just as NATO expansion is not the single reason we're in this situation, but the degrading talk about Russia, about triumphalism and America, is not going to lead to a policy solution. Chaz Freeman spoke the other day. I don't know if you've heard him. We were talking about him, but the painfulness of fighting to the last Ukrainian, which is what could happen if the weapons keep flowing in and there isn't an attempt to do an off-ramp, as some talk. The humanitarian crisis, 7 million or more refugees, displaced people, and this is going to metastasize through Europe. The training in weapons. We're doing some reporting on it, but these are sophisticated weapons that are coming in, and Americans are coming in with them to train. It seems to me that in our politics and our country and our media, there is emotion about what is happening, as any human being must feel, though we see violence so many places, as Jonathan King mentioned. But the opposition to war mustn't prevent efforts to understand history and context that led to this. It's as if you're not permitted to oppose the war because you're pro-Putin. That's not the case. You're pro-peace and you're pro-history and pro-context, which we don't get enough from our media. There is a kind of, and I think this was Matt Taibbi, who I hired as a researcher on a piece 20 years ago, a piece called The Harvard Boys Do Russia. And one disagreement my husband and I had is that I forgave Jeffrey Sachs because he seems to have repented. But he was in there, privatization, Yeltsin, the Harvard Boys. But there's a kind of rhetorical no-fly zone, as Matt put it, where if you raise questions, as we would in the search for peace or the search for an alternative to ongoing endless war, you are demonized, you are called names. And that I don't believe that people have to agree with Noam Chomsky or Steve, but at least you have to listen. And I think the ability to shut people down by calling them names has been a very destructive part of our politics and society. And not just in these last months. Russiagate, you could, listen, I'm sure Russia interfered in some way. The Washington Post had a list about a year ago of 144 places the United States has interfered in, but it just twisted and mangled the politics because you weren't supposed to talk about what are some of the real causal factors in our country that led to the outcome we saw in 2016. I want to speak briefly about what I think is the original sin, but I don't believe, as I said, in one factor. I think there are several factors, but NATO expansion. You know, at the end of the Soviet Union, and by the way, I want to post, Steve wrote a 10.2-page article, some of it's in the book, about how the Soviet Union ended. He very, in a scholarly way, reviewed all the different theories, you know, the empire, corruption, regions, and he came to a view which he never liked because he didn't believe in men making history, you know, but he did because but it, you know, the collision of Yeltsin and Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin had a will to power, Gorbachev had a will to reform. They clashed on the stage. And in that, Yeltsin, the head of Belarus and the head of Ukraine at the time, went into a forest. You've probably read this in Belarus called the Jfk Forest, and signed a treaty ending the Soviet Union. So, but this end of the Soviet Union led to the discussions in Berlin, as you've followed, I'm sure, about the reunification of Germany and the promise to Gorbachev on the part of James Baker and George H.W. Bush and Kohl that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. A few years later, the epicenter of the Cold War, I mean, in 2008, there was the Bucharest summit, and suddenly Ukraine and Georgia were being offered NATO membership. There was a lot more in between, but at that time, people understood, Americans spoke out, there was more of a debate about how dangerous NATO expansion was. And there are documents. I know there are people who still contest that this was an actual promise, but do you know the National Security Archives? It's a very good organization in Washington. They do a lot of work. It's a nonprofit. They do a lot of work on Central America, South America, but they have a team which has all the primary documents from the Gorbachev Foundation and team, which showed the actual primary documents. In any case, even bigger than NATO expansion is what, at the end of the Soviet Union, at the end of the Berlin Wall, there was a triumphalism that America had won the Cold War. Those who were on the scene, like Ambassador Jack Matlock, no one won the Cold War. The Cold War was negotiated to an end. He would say, and Reagan and Gorbachev would say, nuclear war must never be waged, it can never be won. But there was a sense that the Russia that emerged at the end of the Soviet Union was weak, was on its knees, that it was a junior partner. And part of Putin coming to power, and his first act was to give Yeltsin and his family immunity from corruption, was to say, we're going to put this country back together. It collapsed twice, 1917, 1991. And in putting it back together, there was brutality then, Yeltsin's first Chechen war, Putin's second Chechen war. But I would say there were two important dates. 2007, when Putin went to the Munich Security Conference and said, this is no longer a unipolar world, Russia's back. And he spoke of Iraq, it was the height of the Iraq war. And he spoke of no longer being the junior partner. John McCain and Joe Lieberman and Angela Merkel sat in the front row, and their faces are still worth watching today, because you see they went back to Washington and there was great fear that Russia was back. And the second was 2008, which we've talked about, the Bucharest summit, where Ukraine and Georgia were kind of offered quick pass, but the Europeans didn't want it. So I believe that triumphalism. So I want to leave you with a thought that there were roads not taken, there were alternatives. There was an idea at the end of the Cold War that instead of NATO expansion, you might have a transatlantic European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Why, when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, did NATO continue? It is part of what, I mean, I've learned this term, you probably know it, I can never get it right, Ray McGovern. We've had our issues, but Mickey Matt, it's no longer simply the military industrial, and even Eisenhower spoke of it as the military industrial congressional complex, but the media, the internet. But there was a demilitarized path, and there was a different security architecture that was laid out, and that for a brief moment in Berlin before James Baker and, I think the United States they tried to reach out to Russia, but so momentarily and so briefly that there was never a real effort to include Russia in the security architecture of a new Europe. And in that bred grievances. And I'll say two more things. One is, I think we know, and this was moving along, but the idea of what is human security. All the military might in the world isn't going to help with climate crisis. It's going to make it worse, or food shortages, or nuclear proliferation, or global inequality, or pandemics. I mean, you think of the numbers in COVID, you were talking, Jonathan. So that is kind of now put aside, even though Walden Bello, even though he was campaigning, must have been interesting, because a lot of the world is not fully engaged in this Atlantic crisis. I mean, it's a human crisis, but a lot of Asia, Northern Africa, the Middle East, South America, not as engaged. The dismantling of the arms control infrastructure is terrifying. We're here now, and I think Steve is right, that this is as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what's also not fully known, I'm sure you know it, is that the arms control framework has been fully shredded and dismantled. I mean, the big pulling out of the ABM in 2002, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was a foundation of arms control. And by the way, Mr. Bolton, John Bolton, played a role in both that in 2002, and then Trump brings him into the White House, and he abolishes the Open Skies Treaty. The only hopeful, and then the START Treaty has till 2026, but that's not very potent. So you have this shredded arms control infrastructure, and one hopes that somewhere, even in the height of other Cold Wars, though this is a hot war, there were attempts to compartmentalize and begin to deal with some nuclear issues, because it's a terrifying moment. And China may come into this. So I want to end just, you don't negotiate out of fear, as Kennedy said, one of his better speeches, but you never fear to negotiate. And I think somewhere the fear of negotiating comes from the identification of diplomacy, restraint, dialogue with capitulation. It's not as understood how important the work you do, for example, is. June 12th, we're going to do some events around June 12th, 1982 is the 40th anniversary of a million people in Central Park. It played a role around the Global Disarmament UN conference. It also led a few years later to the abolition of an entire class of nuclear weapons in 1987, the INF. And I think we need to continue to commit, even while the UN and the Security Council are in such lockdown. But the General Assembly, the commitment to the abolition of nuclear weapons, the continuing discussions around how to end, not discussions, but urgency to end this war, to find the ceasefire in the next few days, to negotiate, I think is imperative upon all of us. In different ways we can do that. So I thank you as a group for bearing the name peace in your name. And I will say the nation does not have peace in its name, but if there's one consistent thread in our history, founded in 1865, seriously consistent, because we've been ziggy-zaggy, and is the belief that military misadventure abroad does not permit true democracy at home. And I think it's not isolationism. It's an understanding about getting your house in order and working with other countries and not preaching in triumphalism. So thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. That was a terrific overview. We are so grateful. We have time for a few questions. First up, I'm going to call on Amar Ahmed, who is our organizer, and he's also the person that organized that study group you mentioned. Amar, do you want to pose a question?
Great, thank you, Cole, and thank you.
I'm sorry, before you launch in, Amar, let me just mention to others, if you want to put your question in the chat or raise your hand, your virtual hand with the reactions button, we will know that you have a question and we'll try to ask as many as we have time for. Go ahead, Amar.
Thanks, Cole. And thanks, Katrina, for your opening remarks. As you know, we did a book reading club with War with Russia ? With Steve Cohen. It was actually, for me, a very empowering experience. I learned so much, and I was exposed to a perspective that I had never been exposed to before. We also had a webinar with Ray McGovern, and I asked him a question about Steve Cohen, and he said that Steve was his friend, and he said that Steve Cohen was so ostracized in the last years of his life that when he was trying to donate money to a university to create the Cohen Scholarship or the Cohen Fellowship, they wouldn't even accept his money. So my question for you is, why was Steve so ostracized in the last years of his life?
Steve was always a dissenter, but there was more company in the 70s when he spoke for détente, which is an old-fashioned word. I think Steve was early in taking on the worsening relationship. And above all, he never blamed it all on Russia. And not blame, but he thought it took two to tango. I'm sorry, that sounds terrible, but that the United States had a role in poisoning a relationship that was so vital for national security and for the world. What happened in about 2013 as the Ukraine issue, it was Ukraine issue erupted and arose, and Maidan Square, which was both anti-corruption protesters, but also right-wing snipers. But in any case, it was Ukraine. And Steve wrote about Ukraine in ways that led some whippersnappers. They were young, like Isaac Chotiner and Yulia Yoffe and Carol Young and one or two others. These were pundits with some interest in Russia, but they wanted on their belt that, like, so it began with Putin apologist, Putin puppet, Putin toady. And it was like, how many names can you call Steve, who remained an independent figure? And it was ridiculous that he was anyone's puppet. But he was fortunate in that he had tenure. He had taught at Princeton for 30 years. He did worry about a younger generation, which figures in your last question. There's a group called ACES, which is the trade organization for scholars of the Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine. So we wanted to set up a fellowship in the name of Steve's mentor. So it would be Robert Tucker and Stephen Cohen for students who were doing PhD work. We had it all agreed to, and then one summer weekend, we got a long letter of apology that the board had decided Steve's views were difficult for them to stomach, and there needed to be some reconsideration. It worked out. There was a New York Times article, but it was the head of the AAUP, Free Speech Group, stepped in, and others who weren't as involved with Russia, but were horrified by this lockdown of opinion. And in the service, totally independent group that would have awarded the fellowships. It worked out, and it was painful. And Steve really, he despaired, but then he worked, and he believed in the larger work and his larger relationship with Russia, where we had the most eclectic group of friends. One of our great friends, by the way, just received the Nobel Peace Prize at the end of last year. We were talking about Walden Bello, but along with the Filipino journalist, Dmitry Muratov, who founded the newspaper Novaya Gazeta 35 years ago. It's the last paper to have closed in the last few weeks, very independent. And he's had some threats, but Steve was friends with all of these different people. So he understood that in arguing that US played a role in bad relations, Russia did too, that you weren't defaming your country, you were speaking a truth of some kind. Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of people are asking for more detail on the prospective negotiations, or what would a negotiated settlement of this conflict look like?
And perspective on the negotiations and what would be?
And what would a negotiated settlement actually look like?
So the key piece of it, and it was interesting, Biden today spoke about neutrality. Zelensky, as you may know, has spoken about agreeing to a neutrality as long as Ukraine is independent, sovereign, secure. One could have pointed to Finland, but in light of the war and its outcomes, like Finland and Sweden are looking at NATO. But Zelensky's been very clear that neutrality is something he would agree to. And then it would be no entrance to NATO, that would be off the table, but that there would be a kind of security group, not the UN, not the OSCE, but another group that would monitor the security and independence of Ukraine. There would also be language rights. This is a very serious issue. When the leader prior to Zelensky came in, one of the first things they did was ban the use of Russia in schools and textbooks. But half of a quarter of Ukraine speaks Russian. We've seen this problem in the Baltics too. And Russian troops out. So that's the basis. But how you get there, as I said earlier, it's a very tough 10% road, and it does not help that there's not as much energy going into negotiations as there is into canvassing which countries have weapons to ship. It's understandable because but it's going to be a situation. Think of Afghanistan, where we poured in all these weapons. It's fighting to the last Ukrainian. And you can't deny agency, but it's just at this moment, it's also a war that is affecting every part of the globe, even while parts of the globe aren't as invested in the crisis.
Thank you. Brad Wolf asks, what would the alternative security structure and alternative to NATO have looked like?
So there is the OSCE. Sorry?
And the follow-up is, would it be necessary for the US to have been part of that?
So there is, Zelensky, when he came to Washington and gave that dramatic speech, he began to lay out his idea. It was kind of like security plus one. It would be 4 or 5 rotating, maybe not rotating countries. I don't think the United States, but that would guarantee security. Like, you can't do UN peace monitoring very effectively unless there is security on the ground already that they've agreed. There is this group called the OSCE. It may not be effective enough. The Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which came out of Helsinki, the talks in 1975, they are designed to monitor agreements. So I think if there's, not to be glib, but if there's a will, there's a way to find such an institution, which would not be NATO, would not be the UN, but be some design for the situation.
Right. Tom Huff asks, how should we understand the Finns and the Swedes reacting to the Ukraine war with the fear of small states that are on the edge and considering their NATO option? And he comments that his relatives in both countries are in favor.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's serious. Finland lived well by neutrality. I mean, good economy, democracy. I think, and this is heretical, I will say that there was shock February 24th, the night of the invasion, Russia going directly into Ukraine. People who'd studied Russia for 40, 50 years, I think Steve would have been shocked, but Ambassador Matlock, Anatol Lieven, people just couldn't, they stepped away for a few days at least. I thought Russia would come into Donbass, but I don't think, and Crimea is different, I don't see Russia going into Finland or Sweden or the Baltics. I mean, it's kind of a persistent notion of aggression, but the Baltics have been there for, you can't fault Finland and Sweden, but it's going to be more dangerous if they're, I mean, there's this I think NATO has made this part of the world more insecure and more prone to conflict. So I respect those in the country, but I still think it's not the way forward. I think to demilitarize as much as you can, even in the context of this crisis, which we need to work to end.
Thank you. Martin Halper asks, the US has shown no interest in negotiations with Russia or in having Ukraine reaching a negotiated agreement. And I have to interject my own comment that Secretary Austin's comment the other day was very much along that line, saying we're going to weaken Russia. How can we in the peace movement, Martin continues, how can we in the peace movement effectively raise the slogan, negotiate now, as we did during the Vietnam War?
Well, that war went on much longer. I mean, this is now into 2 months, but I think the costs of this war are becoming clearer to, I think, European countries. I may be wrong, but I think the United States, it's now become, as I said, a US-Russia kind of proxy war. And in that, what General Austin said was in sync with what I worried about, the triumphalism, the weakening, the humiliation. And there is a little bit, not too little, but there's a kind of regime change frenzy in the air, which I think is what some in Washington have wanted for a long time. But I think there is an insanity. Biden, we should continue to push Biden, no-fly zone, no-fly zone. There are Democrats talking about men and women. That's not going to happen. But I think there should be a focus on negotiations and do as much as we can through alternative media, through writing your congresspeople. I will say I did a private briefing with 2 other people, Steve Miles and Phyllis Bennis, who's so good. Do you know Phyllis? You know Phyllis. This was about 2-3 months ago, and some of the Progressive Caucus had gone to Ukraine. And Barbara Lee and Pramila Jayapal, who I greatly admire, but they admitted they had not thought about this. There'd been no thought, and this was before war. And to me, again, the Russiagate, for preface, has made it so difficult because Putin has become Trump and Trump has become Putin. And there's no question that there's an illiberalism in Russia. It's a very traditional Orthodox Church. I don't know how you study Russia without the Orthodox Church studying it now. But I'm not being helpful. I think June 12th, these kinds of, and I think the arms control community, I think, has been skittish. But that's an area where I think there's more understanding of the peril now, generationally too, or there could be some work and attention being drawn. I mean, William Perry's no radical. You should get Jerry Brown, by the way, to come speak to you. He would. He's chair of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And he's very concerned about Russia, about nuclear issues, and China. We haven't even talked about China.
Okay, I'll take the bait.
Well, I mean, the national security is the national strategic. It's not the nuclear posture review, but it's the national security doctrine of 2018 had in it that the United States' security doctrine was to downgrade counterinsurgency as a threat, but to make Russia and China our adversaries and to build up in order to confront that danger. I mean, we're talking like 2 or 3 years ago, right? It was before the pandemic. And you think, first of all, this is a national security document. This is anti-security. And now China is being very careful, cautious, and watching, the United States hand, it's stayed separate from this, even though it's been careful because of sovereignty and intervention and US intervention. But maybe the lockdowns or COVID lockdowns are affecting it more than we understand, but China's just watching this and may well benefit. It's sending its wheat around the world as the wheat basket of the world. Russia and Ukraine are in crisis, and it's making off, carefully. But it too is concerned that Taiwan now becomes a frontal issue because of Ukraine. But I think there has to be real agitation against the nuclear security posture and this national security strategy. And there are people, politically, this is not going to be a winning hand for, I hate to say it, for the Democrats. The Republicans are no better because they most of the time say Biden should be tougher, as opposed to let's end endless war. But I do think to begin in your communities. I know you're in Massachusetts, but still, don't treat begin in your communities, write letters, try to speak to people. I end with what I began with, which is if people hear something different, they think, well, I didn't know that. And particularly in this case, so many people don't know how to think. And just to help them think, not help, but begin to lay out a different way of approaching this could seed some important change.
Absolutely, thank you. Let me ask you to lift up your eye from Ukraine, Russia for just one moment and take a look at the Biden presidency as it has evolved, at least on foreign policy. I think you told me you recently been to Cuba. What do you see in what's happening with the Iran deal? What's happening with the Yemen war? What's happening with, you already
Not good things, Paul. Not
Cuba
good. I mean,
embargo?
let me just say Cuba. I was there, and Steve and I were there in 2013 and 14. The sanctions have gotten worse, which is hard to believe. I mean, Trump's sanctions were lousy and cruel and, of course, counterproductive. A lot of people leaving, hunger lines, a lot of entrepreneurship, though, too. But these sanctions are worse to some extent. And it's really about Florida now. It's about Florida and Menendez. And Obama played a big role, bigger than I fully understood, because people in Cuba are still talking about that. And it would be very good, though I guess it's hard because Biden was his vice president, if Obama would take a lead on two of his issues, which would be Cuba and Iran. The Iran, that should be a no-brainer. But of course, it's not for reasons we know. And then also, you have in the Biden administration, and I think domestically, though it's often hard to disentwine domestic and foreign, you have some very good appointments. But foreign policy, though they're young, they're in the mindset of the indispensable nation. I mean, when Antony Blinken went and lectured Xi Jinping, I mean, it's kind of like, okay. But there's a lot of talk, as you know, about the new blocs in the world, authoritarian and democratic. I think they're intermingled in different ways. I mean, in this country, we have and then there's a lot of talk about the rules-based order. Whose rules? International law or the United States' rules? I'm trying to think if there's been, I have to say, I just also think right now that I was struck with a story the other day in the Times, and I'll finish, but how Biden isn't getting credit for like the American Rescue Plan, which put a lot of money in different parts of this country, but some of it is how people relate to government these days. There's a concept called submerged government, which explains why the guy years ago, the Tea Party guy, remember, said, government, get your hands off my Medicare, because it's enmeshed in your life. Social Security, Medicare. And Biden isn't getting credit for some of the improvements. Now, Trump just took his pen and signed checks. I mean, but I think Biden's having a hard time. I think the White House is consumed, as it must be, with this war, and is not having a clear direction, and midterms are always tough for the power, those in power in the White House. I think there's some really smart people in Congress. I'd recommend the Progressive Caucus, though it's had its limits on this issue we're talking about, but Barbara Lee remains a force, and they have taken on Yemen and presidential power and authorization to use military force. And foreign policy is always a tough one. I think the Quincy Institute, with its limits, because realism has its limits, but has been a decent force in countering the kind of neoliberal, neocon think tanks in Washington. But I think there's room for more around the country.
And maybe this is the last question, but we have a massive Pentagon budget increase coming at us, and don't see much in Congress.
No, that's the
They need to
bipartisan.
resist
It's
it.
like, it's the bipartisan agreement. I would have said before the war, because the war has made all of these defense companies, and by the way, they're not many of them anymore. They're like 4. Some monopoly work should be done. But I think that for a lot of people in this country, in Congress, it remains a jobs program in their district. And I think that has to, I remember Seymour Melman decades ago, but a kind of jobs that are more productive for the security of a country. But right now, I can't make it rosy. It's just these defense industries on steroids. And you see the Ukrainian ambassador literally was going to the defense companies to rustle up more equipment. And so there's such a premium on that. And the media, by the way, at press conferences, it's all about how much more weaponry is going to be sent. What's the military plan? And that feeds into the militarization. But I do think there is a way to begin to disentangle the defense budget if it doesn't become a jobs program, which it is in many parts of this country, and infrastructure. But of course it's crazy. I mean, it's 10 times, we have a defense budget 10 times larger than like 7 countries, including Russia and China combined. Now, it doesn't help when Russia and China roll out new hypersonic, but that's an agreement to be had, not to dissolve the accord.
Well, thank you, Katrina.
Thank you.
We just appreciate your work so much. We appreciate the nation so much. Please keep going, build it strong. And
Thank you. I'm sorry it took 2 years.
yeah.
Another, no, I'm grateful. And do check out the American Committee. This week, it's usrussiaaccord.org. We have very interesting readings, usrussiaaccord.org, and The Nation. We've had some good, it is a consistent strand in our, so thank you, Cole, and thank you, and I hope you have a productive meeting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to turn to Mary Ellen Kirkelos to introduce our next speaker. Mary Ellen.
Hi. So yes, hi everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce Kevin Martin, a good friend of Mass Peace Action, president of the DC-based National Peace Action. Kevin has worked tirelessly for nuclear disarmament all of his adult life. He first worked with National as a door-to-door canvasser, apparently in the nuclear freeze movement during those fateful Reagan years. He has traversed the globe, strengthening the peace movement here at home, but also representing peace action at conferences and delegations from Japan to Russia to Mexico. You've seen him certainly in mainstream and alternative broadcast media, and he also writes for legacy publications periodically like the Post and The Nation. as well as a variety of alternative outlets. You may have seen his most recent piece in Common Dreams about the Ukraine war and the heightened risk of nuclear exchange. So Kevin, take it away.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. And it's great to see so many friends. And it's been a while, but when Katrina and I have ever spoken at events together, and I talk about Peace Action's proud history going back to Seine in 1957, you know, we're dwarfed by the nation going back to 1865. But anyway, it's an honor to follow Katrina and also to be with so many fantastic peacemongers. I was given the impossible task of, in 15 minutes, trying to give an overview of Peace Action's priority issue campaigns these days. And I'm going to try to focus more on organizing than policy analysis, but I'm sure some of that will sprinkle through. Thank you, Marilyn, for mentioning the op-ed that I had done last week. It was also in Counterpunch and I think some other places as well. And I think it might be helpful to you, and it's up to you to read it and see, not only what we should be doing in terms of ending this horrible war in Ukraine, but using it as an opportunity to not only call for no escalation, but to take the steps we need to do to rebuild the arms control and disarmament regime, as Katrina mentioned. And I'll get to some of those going forward. On May 7th, many of you know this already, there will be actions around the country, and it may even be a global call to action. And I just saw on the webpage that MAPA already has something scheduled, I believe at Park Street Station. That's often a place that you guys gather on May 7th. And this Thursday at 2, and I don't know if Joseph Gerson is on, I haven't seen him on the screen, but he is helping to coordinate the release of the Common Security Report, which unfortunately now with the war in Ukraine is all too timely. Oh, there he is. And maybe he can even put the Zoom coordinates.
Wanted to make sure you knew he's really here. But
good. Maybe he can put the Zoom coordinates in the chat. Joseph and I were privileged to be part of a conference hosted by International Peace Bureau, which we're longtime members of, in Berlin a couple years ago. And there were people from, I think, 30 some nations around the country. And we were talking then about going back to Olof Palme and, you know, ideas that helped end the Cold War in terms of a new common security structure for Europe. Now, it's had its limitations, unfortunately, and it doesn't just apply to Europe. That report is going to have its official launch here in the United States Thursday at 2, and I highly recommend that. And also, as I said, the May 7th actions on Ukraine. On Yemen, the webinar that we did last week that I organized, but I missed. So some of you know more than I do because you were there and I wasn't. We had a really terrific bunch of speakers, National Peace Action put together, the Yeminar, as I was calling it for short. And of course, we're hopeful about the current ceasefire and the change in the quote unquote leadership of Yemen, Saudi Arabia helping to engineer that, possibly. We don't know exactly. We still don't know if we're going to have a war powers resolution on Yemen, as we were able to do. We passed it twice, but Trump vetoed it both times. For various reasons, it hasn't been introduced yet under the Biden administration, but we're hoping it will be soon. If not, then amendments to defense authorization or other ways to stop all U.S. participation. And once we do that, the war ends. Saudi, UAE, and their coalition really cannot continue the war without U.S. support. So that other forgotten war that has taken a horrible toll now in its 8th year deserves at least as much, in my view, of our attention and activism as the horror in Ukraine. Katrina mentioned Iran. This may go down as one of the biggest blunders by Biden. Biden was the vice president when the Iran deal was signed. He knows everything about it, as do all of his aides. As a matter of fact, I would argue that Biden knows the most about the whole military-industrial complex and U.S. military and foreign policy than any president ever, because he was, 30 years in the Senate and then 8 years as a vice president. They had what should have been an easy layup or slam dunk in the first few months of his presidency, when they still had Rouhani as the Iranian president, he would have probably agreed, readily to extend the agreement or to re-enter the agreement. Of course, Trump caused this problem, and the poison pill of the designation of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Council, as a terrorist designation. I was reading up a little bit about that today, and there are something like several 100,000 families in Iran who have brothers, sisters, fathers, uncles, whoever, that are part of the military and also part of that core. And it's the elite of the Iranian military. They're basically all being, designated as terrorists. It would be as if the Marines were designated as terrorists, which I'm not necessarily against that designation. I don't know who would do it or how that would work exactly, but trying to think about how difficult this hurdle is for Iran to get over. And supposedly this is the last hurdle to get over, and it's not directly related to the nuclear weapons issue and how many kilograms of enriched uranium and blah, blah, all of that, which is what the agreement is supposed to be about. So it's fair enough for Iran to say, well, if you're going to insist on that, we want more sanctions relief or other issues. And so that one sticking point that could kibosh the whole deal is really a terrible problem. And if we have any muscle with members of Congress to get them to weigh in with the administration and say, look, you really need to give on this point so that we can re-enter the Iran anti-nuclear deal and avoid a much larger catastrophe in the region. Talked about the Pentagon budget, of course, 830 billion or more. It's actually 1.2 trillion if you look at the whole quote unquote national security budget, which is more like the global insecurity budget. I just saw SIPRI, their report said something like world military expenditures are over 2 trillion for the first time ever. Well, of course, the United States is about 45% of that. And again, it's much larger if you include other factors in the so-called national security budget. We are in the period, or just after the period, I guess, of the global days of action on military spending. And of course, Peace Action and other groups will be working to do whatever we can to make cuts in the military budget. But of course, you can cut the military budget in half and it wouldn't be good enough for me or for most of us on the call, I'm sure. In terms of nuclear weapons issues, tip of the cap, especially to Senator Markey, the work we've done with him for a long time and the work that you guys have done with him for a long time. He's been a real leader on trying to get some changes in the nuclear posture review. The classified version has been sent to Congress, although I don't know if it's gone to the whole Congress. It may just be some of the leadership of Congress. The unclassified version has not been released publicly, but from everything we know, it's going to be status quo, nuclear weapons forever, pedal to the metal, more money for all kinds of nuclear weapons, including the so-called nuclear modernization of $2 trillion over the next 30 years, which of course we can't afford. And that money needs to go to climate chaos, to pandemics, to affordable housing, to a whole social and economic justice agenda. And if plans continue as they are, it won't. It'll go to nuclear weapons forever. Doesn't look like there will be unfortunately, any movement even on something like no first use or ending sole authority of the president. I don't know if Elaine Scarry is on, but of course her book, Nuclear Monarchy, says so much about our alleged democracy when one person, and it's all men in the 9 nuclear states, have the sole authority to end life on Earth. That absolutely has to change. Unfortunately, again, Biden, who knows these issues better than any president ever, I believe, maybe the first George Bush did, he had the CIA, but right up there, Biden knows all these things and so do his team, and they're seemingly incapable. They're in the thrall of the military-industrial complex. They even came up with a new name for the so-called ground-based strategic deterrent, which of course we're opposing. And I thought it was funny that the word deterrent was actually in the name of the weapon. I think it was kind of defensive on their part. Like, hey, this is only a deterrent. This is not supposed to be the first strike. Hey, deterrence, the magic word. Just say deterrence and everybody accepts nuclear weapons forever. Now it's something like the Sentinel, I think, is part of it. I haven't even bothered to learn the new name of it. I'm glad Katrina mentioned June 12th, the 40th anniversary. I know a lot of you were there. I only became involved in the movement for peace and disarmament about a year later, but I know a lot about it. So there will be at least a couple of virtual celebrations of that anniversary. Then, of course, June 21 to 23 in Vienna, Austria, the first meeting of the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, the first meeting of the states parties. And I was writing about this in the op-ed, and I said, it seems like another world, but there are 86 countries now, I believe, that have signed on to that treaty to make nuclear weapons illegal and to work for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. Then later in August will be the thrice postponed, I believe, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. And that'll sort of lead into our August 6th and 9th Hiroshima and Nagasaki commemorations. Also in the period leading up to that, there will be some commemorations, anniversaries regarding the Korean War, which I will help publicize that as part of my work of the national leadership of the Korea Peace Network. Afghanistan seems to be maybe descending into chaos. I had a few days off, and when I take a few days off, there's like 10 issues I have to bone up on, and I just Google what's going on in Afghanistan, and it just seems horrific. And of course, the United States freezing the funds, the $7 billion of the Afghan people's money. It's not the Taliban's money. The Afghan people's money in the New York Federal Reserve needs to be released, so that the economy can at least have some level of functioning. And of course, the economy in Afghanistan was hurting badly even before the Taliban took over. They've had a drought for 2 years. And of course, the agricultural-based economy of the country, had been in such difficult shape. So Peace Action was one of a number of groups that organized an Afghanistan Day of Action earlier this year, including some Afghan groups, Afghan Americans. And we continue to press on that issue because the people of Afghanistan need to be able to rebuild their economy regardless of who's in government. On Palestine and Israel, I want to give another kudos to Senator Markey. And it's possible Amar or Cole or Brian or somebody may know more than I do about this, but evidently he's thinking of or is maybe open to introducing a companion bill to Betty McCollum's bill in the House, which raises up human rights for Palestinians. If that's true, we would, of course, want to support that, encourage Senator Markey to take that leadership. Peace Action, of course, you guys know this very well, is one of the relatively few peace groups that does direct endorsements and supports candidates for Congress. Not many peace groups do that. Our Peace Voter 22 campaign is well underway. We've endorsed a lot of great candidates, almost all women and people of color, which I think is fabulous, and young for the most part. If the Congress continues to look like it always has, old white men, we're not going to get the changes we want. Next Wednesday, the 5th, is our next Meet the Candidates webinar with Nida Alam, who's running in North Carolina to replace David Price, who's retiring. Some of you, and I think you guys helped sponsor last night, the event for Nina Turner. And we're going to continue those Meet the Candidate events to give people opportunities to support progressive pro-peace candidates around the country. So I think the interesting thing that I wanted to end with is looking at not only June 12th, and then also, as I had mentioned, June 21st to 23rd, in terms of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons first meeting of state parties, but June 18th, the Poor People's Campaign Moral March on Washington. So you look at both of those, June 12th and June 18th, and it's great in terms of a nod to our history and the work that all of us have done, and many of you have done, because I may be one of the younger people on this meeting. So I want to give a nod to the fabulous work for peace and nuclear disarmament that all of us have been doing. And I'm glad to have some younger people as well. And I know MAPA has been doing a good job of bringing younger people into the movement. So June 12th is not only to commemorate the amazing march of 1 million people 40 years ago, but also rededicate to the ever more urgent need for nuclear disarmament and peace and new structures of security around the world. Now, June 18th, the Poor People's Campaign, of course, the Poor People's Campaign goes back to Dr. King. It was started in the last year or two of his life. And the revival of Poor People's Campaign, of course, has been a real boon to the peace and social justice movement in this country. And of course, they link the triple evils that Dr. King talked about in his fabulous speech in 1967 at Riverside Church a year before he died, but that also he talked about a lot the triple evils of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation. And of course, now updating that to include climate change. So we're hoping that enough, and of course, travel, carbon footprint, COVID concerns, all of those are real that might prevent some people from coming to Washington. But we think and we hope enough peace action affiliates and chapters from the East Coast and from the Midwest at least might come so that we will have a peace action contingent, if not a peace action contingent, a larger contingent with other peace groups. And some of you may recall 2 years ago, we had scheduled our Peace Action National Organizers meeting and lobby days here in Washington right after the Poor People's March so that we could contribute to both, so that we could participate in both. Of course, COVID had other plans. We had to cancel our event. They did a great online event then, but we're hoping that this year, the in-person gathering here in Washington and the march will be very successful. So I really like this confluence within a week, a nod to our history as an organization and a movement, but also to the continuity in the struggles for peace and social justice that are ongoing, and that I'm so proud to work with you guys and our affiliates and chapters around the country and our partners around the world. I'm sure that I gave short shrift to many issues that Peace Action works on. And in 100% of the speeches I've ever given to a Peace Action event, somebody says, what about this issue? What about that issue? So feel free if you want to. That's the best I can do in a quick overview of the sprawling agenda that all of you help support and help make possible.
Thank you, Kevin. We appreciate that so much. There's a lot to do, a lot to work on. And thanks to Peace Action for its leadership in helping us chart a path through all these difficult problems. I'm going to pass it to Brian Garvey, who's going to launch us into MAPPA's program overview. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Cole, and thanks, Kevin, for updating us on everything that Peace Action is working on. Heard a mantra recently that I think I'm going to adopt. I'll borrow it from Michael Inouye, who's an activist out in Hawaii. But that mantra is that hope is a discipline, and the issues that we're working on, they've taken a long time. People have dedicated their lives to them, but we know that we're going to get there if we can keep working. So to give you more rapid fire information, even more than Kevin did, I'm going to be introducing our program with the help of 14 different people. So we're going to have to be quick. It's 3 minutes apiece, and just to let all of our speakers know, I'll be giving you a warning at 30 seconds, so you can just wrap up your thoughts at that point. I know that this is just a snapshot of all of these different areas of our work, but that's okay, because next week, in part 2 of our annual meeting, you can go more in depth, because we're going to have breakouts associated with all of these different presenters, and you can spend an hour learning more about each of these areas of work and how you can get more involved. This is a good segue off something that Kevin said. We know in the peace movement that it's important to bring in the next generation. And so I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, and that will be Alec Neely, who is leading our internship program. Alec?
Thank you, Brian. Hi, everybody. As Brian said, my name's Alec. I'm a Northeastern student and a former MAPPA intern myself. And recently, one of the things that I've been doing is trying to wrangle this group of about 9 interns that we have this time around, which has been really great. It's really taken off since when I was an intern just a year ago. It was only myself and one other part-time intern. And this semester we have 5 full-time interns and I believe 4 part-time interns who are at least a part of our intern group. So the interns, a few of whom we actually have on the call today, when we were first starting, had decided to support 2 ballot initiatives. both the Fair Share Initiative, the Millionaires Tax, as well as opposing the app-based drivers initiative, which was basically a repeat of Prop 22 in California. So that is now something that MAPA has officially endorsed opposition to. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of space for them to work in that area, and they found that those groups running them didn't really have a lot for them to do. So they pivoted quite quickly and started a new idea, which was to engage with the Poor People's Campaign on exactly what you were just hearing about a minute ago and the massive event going on in DC this summer. And that was all themselves, self-directed, which was really impressive. And I'm glad that we could have that kind of turnaround. In general, I've been really impressed with how the interns have managed to kind of, manage themselves. And they've been doing a lot of really great work, both this semester and last semester, the interns that we have. The most notable thing maybe for a lot of you, their participation in the working groups, or for those of you who aren't in the working groups, you may have realized at some point that the logo has changed and is now nice and schwanky. And that was one of our lovely interns last season. There have been a lot of takeaways and a lot of good things coming out of this, out of the intern program, just in terms of how better to manage them and how better to manage our work as an organization going forward. And those are things that we only can really learn from a whole bunch of new people and a whole bunch of young people coming in and saying that they love this, but that doesn't work. What are you people doing? It's only those sorts of interactions that we're really learning from. So, but I know that I've enjoyed my time with them a lot, and they have enjoyed their time with you all. And the one thing that was unanimous the other day when I talked to them was that every single one of them felt that MAPA had a plethora of expertise to go around, of great knowledge, of great perspectives, and it was an absolute diversity of opinion and discussion that made their experience so fantastic. So on their behalf, I don't think they'll fault me for thanking you all for the opportunity that they've had so far. I know I thank you for the opportunity that I have had as well, and I think that's a good place to end it off.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alec. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Susan Ruskin, who's going to update us on the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group.
The Nuclear Disarmament Working Group is one of the longest functioning groups in MAPA, with about 150 members on listserv and 15 to 25 regularly attending meetings. Many members are active in other organizations, so that our purview is a national rather than solely Massachusetts. Our meetings and work reflect a wide range of issues relating to nuclear weapons and disarmament, especially now given the war in Ukraine and the US nuclear buildup. We have 4 wonderful interns who have been actively taking part in our various activities. We have 4 subcommittees, the TPNW pushing the US to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Cole, please put the info in chat. Thanks. At present, we are working to support state legislation, H3688 and S155, which would set up a special citizens commission to investigate and make recommendations about the relationship between nuclear weapons and the Commonwealth. Massachusetts is a potential target given all the companies involved in nuclear arms production. We have until next Tuesday to try to get the bill out of committee. If you want to help, see nuclearban.us/mass or contact Cole. Second, public engagement and movement building, which focuses on identifying and collaborating with various types of peace groups within Massachusetts. Interns are currently working on a student-led program to engage college students on the issues of nuclear weapons. A third subgroup, missile defense, aims to promote awareness and education in the peace community about US deployment of missile defense systems globally, which is contributing to our nuclear arms race with Russia and China. And fourth, 1010, the elimination of nuclear weapons within the decade, whose goal is to speed motion toward complete nuclear disarmament. This is now part of our new mission statement. The No First Use campaign now has its own meetings, but functions in close relationship with the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group. We address the dangers of nuclear power, its relationship to nuclear weapons, and to the environment. We continue to be involved with what is happening at the nuclear Pilgrim plant in Plymouth. We work with cities and towns within Massachusetts to pass the Back from the Brink resolutions and become mayors for peace communities. We continue to relate the costs of nuclear weapons to human needs. We work on state and federal legislation, organize webinars and conferences as a path to building the movement from below, write letters and articles, participate in demonstrations and standouts. And our next meeting is this coming Sunday, May 1st at 5 p.m. New members are most welcome to our working group and to subgroups. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was 10 seconds shy of 3 minutes. So perfect, Susan. Next up is Paul Shannon, who's going to be speaking for the Middle East Working Group. Paul, you're muted. Just unmute yourself and
Thanks, Brian.
there you go.
So, well, even in the midst of this hot war with Russia and Cold War with China, things are still boiling in the Middle East. And so I'm speaking for the Middle East Working Group of MAPA. And, you know, here we face still humanitarian crises, ongoing wars, threats of new wars. With all this going on, we hope that you will consider joining us. We could use more people who are really interested in bringing, changing US policy in this area, which is so critical. And to help you understand a few things that we're working on, I've asked some members of the Middle East Working Group to kind of touch on a few of these areas. So Jeff Klein will fill us in a little bit about Syria. Yes, Syria.
Thanks, Paul. On Syria, we've held webinars to educate people about the illegal foreign interventions in that country, which were led by the US spending billions to arm the internal, often radical Islamist opposition. We demand the withdrawal of all US and NATO member Turkey's occupying forces in Syria, which have imposed a de facto partition of the country and stolen Syria's oil and grain resources. We condemn the brutal sanctions that punish ordinary citizens and are driving millions into poverty and food insecurity. And it's worth noting here that the same propaganda methods we see today about Ukraine were first practiced and perfected against Syria since 2011.
Let's keep that in mind. Thank you, Jeff. Next, we're lucky to have Tom Huff talk about this critical Iran nuclear deal. You're muted, Tom.
I've been involved with Iran since 1967 as a Peace Corps volunteer and person working in Iran since that time. From my perspective, the JCPOA was probably the high point of diplomacy in the Middle East in the last 50 years. And that was reiterated by many of the senior diplomats who've been on many of the Atlantic Council meetings that I've attended as a member. After I disagree with Martin's assessment that there was an open path to quick approval in the first months, the Iranian regime had already basically pulled the plug on their current leadership, waiting for a more conservative leadership to arrive. But after a year of domestic foot dragging by both sides, we are just as guilty as the Iranians on that score. There looks to be a possible path forward as we speak. Today in Washington, in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Secretary Blinken committed to scheduling a formal hearing before Memorial Day. 3 more working sessions this week focused on the JCPOA. This might indicate that there's a path, but my contacts at the Atlantic Council are pessimistic. But there is no better option than all of us that have been working on this to peace than getting the Revolutionary Guard designation removed and eliminated, and perhaps that will be able to get us beyond the Republican opposition. And it's become a sadly polarized party-related foreign policy issue, which it makes no sense whatsoever. So there is some hope, but there is a lot of pessimism.
Okay, Tom, so a lot of work to do there. And now Afghanistan still. Afghanistan, Valmogadon.
Yes, thanks. We include Afghanistan in our work in the Middle East working group. And we've been working on Afghanistan since the group's inception. Over the past 2-3 years, we've organized several webinars that have focused on the origins of the crisis in Afghanistan from the late 1970s throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s to unpack the very complicated history and political history even before 9/11 and the U.S. invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. We've also focused on the deficits and the American military presence and the cost to both the U.S. taxpayer and, most importantly, to the Afghan people and their prospects for peace and social development. And most recently, on Valentine's Day, in fact, we helped organize a national day with other peace action affiliates, which was called To Afghanistan with Love, demanding the frozen assets be returned to Afghanistan. You know, I should share with our colleagues that, of course, we welcome the U.S. military retreat from Afghanistan, but internally we had some debate as to whether to call for the release of funds to the Taliban, especially because of the terrible track record of the Taliban, the absence of a program for reconciliation and reconstruction, and the Taliban's lack of international recognition. But eventually we all agreed that the funds should be released. And of course, that was promoted at the Valentine's Day event. But of course, we remain distressed by the apparent decision to ban girls' schooling above the primary level. So, you know, Kevin is quite right that the chaos continues.
So lots to do. Join us.
Thanks, Paul. Next, I'm going to turn it over to the co-chair of our Latin America and Caribbean Working Group, Yoav Yelenevsky. Yoav? Go ahead, Yoav.
Well, good evening, everybody. We at the Latin America and Caribbean Working Group form book groups. We organize educational webinars. We hold rallies. We pressure politicians to oppose wars, blockades, colonialism, sanctions, and regime change operations, and in general, move them farther in the direction of peace and justice. We support delegation of young activists to Central America and Cuba. We hold meetings every third Wednesday at 5 p.m. You are invited. We created several subgroups that work on specific issues and countries such as immigration, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Our mission is to educate, to organize, to collaborate with other US and international organizations in promoting policies and securing legislations that will prevent the United States from interference in Latin America and the Caribbean. Let me give you a specific example of what we are doing. I would like to invite you to a webinar on Haiti we are doing tomorrow, Wednesday, April 27 at 7 p.m. Join us to learn what is going on in Haiti nowadays and also learn about the greatest haste in history. Let me tell you what it is. In the 18th century, Haiti was the richest colony in the world. It was a money-making machine that was based on 500,000 African slaves kidnapped from their homeland and shipped in chains to work in plantations to grow sugar, indigo, cotton, coffee for the benefits of the slave owners and the growing French industrial elite. Haiti was not only the most profitable colony, but also the cruelest. In 1791, the slaves in Haiti rebelled against the slave masters, French slave masters, defeated the French, Spanish, and British armies and navies. And in 1804, Haiti became a free republic, the only successful slave revolt in history. The US and Europe reacted by imposing a blockade and sanctions on Haiti. In 1825, the French king, Charles X, sent an armed flotilla of warships to Haiti with the message that the young nation would have to pay France 150 million francs to
3
secure
minutes,
its
30
independence
seconds, Yoav.
or suffer the consequences. That sum was 10 times the amount of United States has paid France in the Louisiana Purchase. So what is happening here? It's that the former slaves of Haiti, not the French slave owners who were forced to pay reparations. This is the biggest haste in history. Please join us as we are launching a campaign to undo this injustice. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Yoav. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who's going to report back on the delegation to Cuba. Kate.
Thanks so much. Cole, should I share the slides?
I will start them in 1 sec.
Okay, I'll get started without them, but let me just pull them up so I can see them while I talk. Hi, everyone. I'll be reporting on our recent Napa Cuba trip, which was an exploratory trip we took in early April. And on this trip, there were 10 of us, including Mary Ansara, who's lived part-time in Cuba for several years. It also included 3 MAPA board members, Cole, the executive director, working group leaders, and student interns like myself. And the goal of this trip was really to learn about Cuba, past and present, and to understand how to connect our progressive struggles with those in Cuba. And I would say we were pretty successful in meeting these goals. During the week, we met with scholars, activists, diplomats, community leaders, and others, and we visited museums, health centers, government organizations, and a neighborhood development project called La Timba, which is what you can see in the bottom right photo there. That's us at that neighborhood development project. And in that bigger photo on the left, you can see our group with our host, which was the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the People, or ECAP. This group set up our meetings, or most of our meetings, and we worked really closely with them to understand the revolution and the social project of Cuba. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. But over the course of the 5 days, we had a lot of meetings, and you can see some of those here. On the left, you see us with the Director of U.S. Affairs at the Cuban Ministry of Foreign Relations. On the right, you see us meeting with Palestinian medical students to discuss foreign policy. And then in the middle, we're at an outdoor seating area at a really great restaurant we went back to a couple of times, learning about the current government and political situation in Cuba from a political scientist, Rafael Hernandez. So those were really just a few of our meetings, and some others included discussions with Cuban peace activists, musicians, local members of the Federation of Cuban Women. There were a lot of meetings. They were great. And some of them took us to really cool places, including the neighborhood family doctor office and polyclinic, and the home of Norma Gillard, who's a psychologist, feminist, and activist in the Afro-Descendant Women's Network. So yeah, here in the group photos, both of those experiences are captured in the bottom 2 photos. And some of our other trips included the Fidel Castro Center, which was a major highlight for a lot of us, the Bay of Pigs Museum, and a national park. So I'd say that as a group, we came away with big and new understandings about the Cuban Revolution and social project, the issues that we just face as a global community, and in general, how this all relates to our work at Mass Peace Action. And one big takeaway for our group is that the US blockade of Cuba has to be opposed and defeated, as do all other sanctions that are curbing the sovereignty of other countries. And so we've got a lot of energy coming back to put into MAPA's Cuba subgroup that's focused on ending the US blockade against Cuba. And we also have a lot of energy to work to inform and influence the projects of all of the other working groups we're learning about tonight based on our trip. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. Next, I'm going to hand it over to Amar, who's going to update us on our No Cold War working group.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it's really hard to follow up the Cuba trip, but here we go. So yeah, our No Cold War working group, we're interested in a U.S. Cold War on Russia and China because of current events. Our group has seen more interest and engagement in recent months. We meet monthly and we have a group of people that stretches all generations. So it's really exciting. We have a focus on educating ourselves and others. We're a small but growing group that has engaged in some powerful activities over the last year. Here are some of them. We organized a series of webinars with Code Pink's China is Not Our Enemy campaign on the topic of US relationship with China. We worked with Code Pink to organize a standout at Senator Markey's office protesting an anti-China bill. We have organized a series of webinars on a variety of topics. Some of our webinars, for example, with Ray McGovern, Ben Norton, have received thousands of views. Collectively, our webinars have received tens of thousands of views, which is actually really good for MAPA. It helps us grow our email list and our social media, and also helps recruit members for our working groups. We started a subgroup, our Jfk Peace Group. We're really focused on our history, our anti-war history, anti-nuclear history. We study Norman Cousins. We did a speech screening that was over 350 people registered for that from all over the world, including Europe and Asia and South America. We did a book study group. We read War with Russia ? Written by Steve Cohen, the husband of our keynote speaker tonight, and Professor Emeritus at Princeton and CBS correspondent for Russia. That was a really great experience. We're going to do another book club coming up. So we've also written articles for the MAPA newsletter and did congressional advocacy. So we're engaged in a lot of work. We've helped organize rallies, and we have a meeting coming up on Thursday. So I'll share my email in the chat if anybody is interested in joining our No Cold War with Russia and China working group.
Thanks, Amar. Next, I am going to pass it over to Cole, who's going to update us on our Ukraine committee.
Thank you, Brian. Shortly after the Russian invasion on February 24th, MAPA debated our policy and realized we have a range of views inside of the organization, and we respect all those views. We agree on much more than we disagree. But the majority adopted a position, and we formed the Ukraine Emergency Committee to carry out the work. We condemn the Russian invasion and call for Russian troops out. We also point out that the relentless expansion of NATO up to Russia's borders laid the basis for Russia to fear for its security and provoked it to lash out. The US supported the Maidan coup of 2014, which shifted Ukraine's government towards the US. The US has not sent troops or declared a no-fly zone, but it has provided weapons, training, money, and intelligence, not just since the current war started, but since 2014. Ukraine is a US proxy war. MAPA calls for an immediate ceasefire, a negotiated settlement, protection of the rights of the Russophone minority within Ukraine, Ukrainian neutrality, and no NATO expansion. We oppose US arms shipments to Ukraine. We oppose a no-fly zone and broad economic sanctions on Russia, which hurt the ordinary people. And we call for President Biden to declare a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. The confrontation with Russia is being used to justify huge increases in the Pentagon budget, and we must push back against any increase. MAPA has organized 3 rallies so far for peace in Ukraine this spring in coordination with the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, which is led by Code Pink, Stop the Wars UK, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and the No to NATO Network. Our next rally, I believe Kevin mentioned it, will be Saturday, May 7th at Park Street in Boston. And we'll also hold another one on June 25th on the eve of the NATO summit in Madrid. We ask everyone to turn out for those rallies, and we urge other cities to organize rallies on those 2 international days of action. Go to peaceinukraine.org. We'll have a rally organizing meeting tomorrow at 5:30. Contact me if you would like to attend. That's just for Massachusetts. We are also organizing 2 fundraising concerts for humanitarian relief in both Ukraine and Yemen, a piano quintet on May 20th, and an all Mozart evening by the Music for Peace Chamber Orchestra on June 4th.
Thanks, Cole. Next, I am going to turn it over to Jax and Chloe, who are going to talk about our Palestine-Israel working group. Let me bring you to the screen. Take it away.
Oh, there we go. Okay. I was forcibly muted, but I'm here. So yeah, our Palestine-Israel working group meets once a month, and we're made up of a number of experienced, longtime activists in the Palestine solidarity work, as well as 3 Northeastern interns. We work to raise awareness around Palestinian rights through public education, coalition building, and direct action, as well as advocate for political and legislative change in Congress and in the Massachusetts legislature. We also seek to continuously educate ourselves, our community, and our elected representatives about the Palestinian struggle as part of our work. Our goal is to change U.S. policy away from its one-sided support for Israel and to end U.S. financial and political support for Israeli apartheid and the occupation of the Palestinian people. I will pass to Chloe to give some details on our current work.
Right now, some of our short-term goals are we're hosting a standout on Monday at Representative Catherine Clark's office to protest her recent endorsement by AIPAC to ask her to make a statement condemning the terrorist designation of 6 NGOs by Israel and to pressure her to take Palestinian-friendly stances and actions in Congress. We will follow up this action with meetings with their staff, more standouts, and webinars that will educate the public on AIPAC. Another campaign we have been driving for a few months now and will continue to work on is pressuring the U.S. government to demand that Israel revokes the terrorist designation placed on 6 Palestinian NGOs. A subgroup of our members have put together a petition that has mobilized constituencies from different districts in Massachusetts to sign on, which we will deliver to the Biden administration in the next week, hopefully. We are working to increase congressional support of HRES 751, a resolution condemning the terrorist designation placed on the 6 Palestinian NGOs, and HR 2590, a bill that would limit U.S. aid to Israel and demand Israel-specific reporting requirements regarding their activities in the West Bank. We are working to foster this support in Congress through direct meetings with representatives and their staff about Palestinian issues. And lastly, we're working to increase public education and awareness around the fight for Palestinian rights through our upcoming public educational events and actions. Activities we will continue to plan to further our goals consist of hosting regular webinars and educational events for our MAPA audience and the Massachusetts public, sending out regular action alerts with information and avenues for action that Massachusetts residents can take to make their voices heard and apply pressure to the representatives and senators, and holding public actions to draw attention to current events happening in Palestine and to those who are complicit in supporting Israel's apartheid. We would love to have you join our group, and please feel free to reach out to either Jax or I, and we'll drop our information in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe and Jax. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Claire Gosselin, who's going to talk about our racial justice and decolonization working group.
Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you just fine.
Okay, great. So first of all, I'd like to pose a question. Why is this working group relevant to peace? Well, as we know, enslaving Africans and genocidal wars against Native Americans and the theft of their lands created great wealth for the U.S. settler colonial nation. And it set the pattern for future wars of domination and exploitation. While the injustices of slavery continue in different forms, descendants of the colonizers have a responsibility to join the struggle to address these harms. I want to give a little background. At our MAPA annual meeting in 2015, we had Reverend Sekou speak of his experience in Ferguson, Missouri during the uprising in response to the murder of Michael Brown. That was August 10th, 2014. Following his talk, we had a workshop session on racial justice and peace, Black Lives Matter, mass incarceration, police militarization, and inequality. Of course, this is intended to foster action for racial justice, But then we learned from attorney Carl Williams, who was there, that he and others experienced racist impacts from comments and exchanges in the session. This led to our forming the working group, which focused first on racism, joining in actions led by people of color and studying works on racism authored by Black people. Then we added decolonization as it pertains to the Indigenous experience. As a rule, we follow the lead of organizations led by people of color and Native peoples for legislative advocacy and actions, and we turn out for their events. So we have two subgroups. One is the Indigenous Solidarity subgroup, and Craig Simpson is a key person on that to contact. We basically, just some of the work we have plans for in the coming year is support for Indigenous leadership in the peace and environment movements, like Saving the Pine Barrens, their coalition of land and water, and land back initiatives, to name a few. Also to work in coalition for the Massachusetts Indigenous legislative agenda, as well as for the freedom of Leonard Peltier, and to educate MAPA and others on Indigenous concerns through Native leaders' voices and webinars, readings, films, and events. The racial justice subgroup plans include decarceration as our primary campaign, and this, of course, includes legislative work, as well as support for reentry services, opposition to prison industries, and the oppressive parole system. We also prepare articles, webinars, and field trips to educate MAPA and others on white supremacy, including voter suppression and police militarization. We're also planning to mobilize for the June 18th Poor People's Campaign event in Washington, D.C., which you've already heard about tonight. And Ahmad of MAPA is involved in that organizing. So there's a number of people listed at the bottom of the screen there that you can contact. You have our emails as well as our phones, and we hope you'll join us or consider participating at times. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Claire, for that. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Rosalie Anders, who's going to update us on our Peace and Climate Working Group.
Okay.
Up on the screen. Take it away, Rosalie.
Okay, so Peace and Climate Working Group. We know how deeply interconnected peace and climate are, and our goal is to bring together the issues and the activists. Some members of our group also belong to climate organizations such as 350 Massachusetts, Mothers Out Front, UU Mass Action, and the Extinction Rebellion. And we've been working on bringing war, peace, militarism issues into their work. We've done a bunch of well-attended Zoom webinars around the impacts of the military and the links with the climate emergency. We partner with climate groups around particular holding actions, including protests and legislative efforts. We show up to lobby. We see three kinds of actions needed for change. Holding actions, which of course is what peace and climate activists put great energy into. Changing consciousness, and building new structures and institutions. We partner with climate groups around particular holding actions, protests, and legislative efforts. And these are vital and can be a great way to engage people. Cutting the military budget is an important holding action, and we try to engage climate groups around that. But as peace activists, we also need to foster new ways of thinking in the climate movement, to embrace the need to shift our foreign and military policy away from a confrontational us versus them international order and instead foster international cooperation. Nations need to understand the need to work together to save the planet. This seems essential to our peace and climate work. Our Peace and Climate Group is also wrestling with a shift in consciousness, how to change the paradigm of our exploitive, capitalist, materialistic, violence-supporting culture. A subgroup, our Paradigm Shift Group, wrestles with how to make the basic shifts in thinking and values necessary to deal with the climate emergency and how to foster new structures that are beginning to arise. Last month, we had a successful workshop in which we expressed and shared deep fears and anger over what is happening in the world And in the year ahead, we will continue to explore how this kind of work can be part of building the strong communities we need to create a successful movement. So we encourage everybody to join us in this really exciting work.
Thank you so much, Rosalie. Next, I want to turn it back over to Amar, who's going to update us on Fund Healthcare Not Warfare. Go ahead, Amar.
Thanks, Ryan. Our Fund Healthcare Not Warfare working group, we started as a response to the COVID pandemic. We brought together people from different healthcare and public health constituencies, including nurses, public health experts, single payer activists, biomedical researchers, peace activists, and more. In 2020, 2021, and now in 2022, we continue on with our webinar program, covering a wide range of topics, most recently, youth mental health in the era of COVID. This year, the American Public Health Association is having their annual meeting in Boston. We are working to engage with the annual meeting in the form of a plenary panel or a breakout group or some other format. We'll also be submitting an abstract to the APHA. This work dovetails well with another project we've been working on, outreaching to our networks in other states to discuss Fund Healthcare Not Warfare and encourage the formation of Fund Healthcare Not Warfare work groups in other states. Such groups have either been started or are being considered in various places, including Staten Island, Maryland, Chicago, and more. By having Fund Healthcare Not Warfare groups in other states, we're more powerful when we come together, such as to promote a Fund Healthcare Not Warfare message at the APHA. Over the last year, we've had some amazing work and contributions from our young interns. One example, our intern, Kate Henning, who presented on the Cuba trip, she's leading our work in vaccine justice. Just this Thursday, she's working with a group called Justice is Global, and she's organized webinars about vaccines and other topics for us. This Thursday, Kate will be emceeing a protest outside Moderna in Cambridge, and I'll be there with some friends and family. So if you can come through, we're meeting at Galaxy Park in Cambridge at 5 p.m. To protest Moderna to release the patent and free the vaccine. So that's happening at 5 p.m. and our intern Kate is leading that. The St. Vincent nurses had a strike this last year, and we supported the striking nurses by mobilizing people to the picket line. We also held webinars to amplify the message. We made stronger connections with nursing communities, including Katie Murphy, the president of Mass Nursing Association, who spoke at many of our events. And lastly, we continue to keep a close eye on and advocate for relevant legislation at the state level. For example, we are supporting and advocating the SAFE 2.0 bill, which would shore up public health infrastructure and resources. And we championed our Taxpayers' Right to Know bill, which has some exciting updates. It progressed through a committee in the state Senate recently. Thank you. And I'll share my email in the chat to join both, either the No Cold War Working Group or the Fund Healthcare Not Working Group. There it is in the chat.
Excellent, Amar. And just a reminder that, if you want to hear more in depth about these, join us next week. And also our working groups are open for new members. Next, I'm going to give a brief update about our Raytheon anti-war campaign, which is a coalition of peace and anti-war groups that includes Massachusetts Peace Action that was founded back in 2018. The original purpose of the campaign was to use Raytheon's extensive presence here in the Bay State, including its headquarters in Waltham, to raise awareness about the U.S. role in Saudi Arabia's over 7-year war on the country of Yemen. Over the last 3.5 years, the campaign has also worked to prevent war with Iran and to highlight Raytheon's role in nuclear weapons production. The campaign is a way to localize war and peace issues that may seem far away for the everyday person. So we've done dozens of rallies, vigils, webinars, and standouts. We've introduced a divestment bill into the state legislature to compel the Commonwealth to remove the state pension fund from companies that sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, including Raytheon. We continue to need help with research and outreach So really, there are many ways to get involved, depending on what your strengths are and what your interests are. Members of our campaign have lobbied in favor of a reintroduction of the Yemen War Powers Resolution. Kevin talked a little bit about this earlier. And actually in February, Reps Jayapal and DeFazio released an op-ed in The Nation stating their intention to reintroduce a Yemen War Powers Resolution. So there's going to be an upcoming fight on that. Late last year, we joined with allies in Asheville, North Carolina, and Tucson, Arizona, who formed the War Industry Resistors Network, which is a new coalition that has linked now over 24 local and regional groups across the country that are fighting back against the military-industrial complex in their own backyards. By forming the new network, we're working to amplify each other's messages and increase our political power. So we've done several webinars with that network over the past 4 months, linking the military-industrial complex to the struggle for indigenous rights, climate struggles, to push back against how these companies have infiltrated our culture. And we also have an upcoming webinar on the militarization of the borderland. The network just participated in its first coordinated week of action around tax day, just this past week, to highlight the war industry's connection to our ever-growing military budget, which is something we're always talking about. There were 27 actions across the country, so it was a really successful outing. And the Raytheon anti-war campaigns action that we did here was 1 week ago. We marched through the financial district and visited banks and investment companies that are heavily invested and do extensive business with weapons manufacturers like Raytheon, as well as fossil fuel companies, linking the struggles for peace and for climate justice. So I invite you to get involved and return next week to learn more about how you can get involved with the Raytheon anti-war campaign. And with that, I'm going to pass it actually back over to Amar, who's going to update us on our efforts with the Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brian. Yes, so we at Mass Peace Action, we are working very closely with the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign to mobilize people for the June 18th mass assembly and moral march on Washington and to the polls. There are many MAPA volunteers and board members and interns who are actually going to DC on June 18th and are also working to mobilize people from our networks. There are buses leaving from Boston and all over Massachusetts to go to DC on June 18th. In order to mobilize people, the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign, we've organized into various working groups. There's a theomusicology working group, for example. There's a faith working group working to mobilize people from faith communities. And there's a partners working group, which many of us at MAPA, myself including, are part of. We are working to, our partners working group is working to mobilize people from MAPA and from organizations we have connections with. There's also a student and outreach working group doing campus outreach for June 18th. I presented to our 5 full-time interns from Northeastern about going to DC for June 18th with the hope that 1 or maybe 2 of them might want to go. All 5 of them wanted to go, so that was so exciting. And not only are they going, we created a student outreach working group, and they're doing campus outreach and organizing to go to June 18th and have started getting registrations. So that is really exciting. That group is also led by our intern, Kate Henning. So yes, everyone, please mark your calendars for Saturday, June 18th and join us in DC if you can. And we'll be promoting the June 18th Mass Assembly more in coming days and weeks through MAPA and our working groups and in our communications. So if you're interested in going, or if you know others who might be interested in going, you can contact me, or you could contact Kate Henning, or you could contact Jonathan King. You could contact any of us. And we're really excited to go to DC with the Poor People's Campaign and Code Pink and everyone else on June 18th.
Thanks, Amar. That is really exciting. Next, I'm going to pass it over to Packy Wheeland, who's going to update us on some Western mass organizing. Take it away.
So, hi, yes, just want to remind you that there is life beyond 495. And we are part of of mass peace action. Of course, most of you know Yoav Elenevsky, and of course, you know Mary and Sarah, who guided you through Cuba and other things. But as you all probably know, or maybe don't, that, you know, a number of years ago, AFSC was defunded and the Resistance Center came into being, and it has now really come closed down. But to the rescue came mass peace action. And on March 22nd, we had a large 35-person attended meeting with Cole and you folks in the eastern part of the state to look at how Western mass could become more officially connected to mass peace action. And the consensus, as I heard it and saw it, was that people are really anxious to do that, really happy to be part of MAPA, and to have that much more formal, and so you'll actually get real reports from more people out in Western Mass. But so thanks very much for reaching out to us, for knowing that we are part of the Commonwealth, and you'll also have the opportunity to know more about what we're doing with our, for example, our L3 Harris, that is a complement to Raytheon, because Raytheon couldn't drop its bombs without L3 Harris's technicians. So thank you, and stay tuned. Another meeting is coming in May to more formalize this and to progress this conversation. So thanks to MAPA.
Thank you so much. East meets West, right? I've been out there and I've never seen any dragons, so beyond 495.
Come back.
Thank you all for making those presentations. I know it's not easy to talk about your work in less than 3 minutes, but lo and behold, you did it. And for those who want to learn a bit more, we are going to be coming back next week, and we're going to have breakouts that are going to be an hour long, and you can learn much more in depth what these groups are up to and how you can make a contribution to them. But with that, we are going to thank you, Cole, for putting up our program summary, and I'm going to ask everyone to unmute themselves, and I'm hoping that we can do this by voice vote, but I am proposing that we affirm this program and adopt it as you just heard it from all of our wonderful presenters. Do I have a second?
Sí, cómo no.
All right. Someone second the motion to affirm.
Yes, second.
And all in favor of adopting the program as you just heard it.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Sounds like a bunch of pirates. Aye, ladies.
Or if they put it, aye.
Yes. All opposed? Hearing none, except for some background. I take it that we are affirming this program, and thanks again to all the presenters. I know that wasn't easy. You're working to 3 minutes. I really appreciate it. And that, I'm going to pass it to our co-chair of the board of directors, Jonathan, who's going to talk a little business.
Right. All right. Very quickly, or not so quickly. You know, everybody in this meeting is here because of passion for the issues, and your heart sinks when it comes to business. But the extraordinary political range that you just heard is because we have built an organization that is really democratic. It runs from below. It runs by people. It is very different from most of the organizations around the country, many of who are allies, but they're really think tanks. We're not dependent on on the Plowshares Fund or other deep-pocketed things. We live on donations from thousands of our members, and that is why we can have the political independence that we do. Now, to many of you, you know, we're not getting far with the Congress. Things look very depressing, But in fact, if you look in the other direction, we are making connections. We are building a network whose influence we can't yet see, right? But it is growing, it is emerging. And actually Mass Peace Action is in many ways is a kind of light post for groups across the country. For example, our activities in the state legislature are a model for groups all across the country. In years to come, we're going to see that picked up. The working with the Poor People's Campaign, forging a national network. Ryan talking about the war resistors and the divest campaigns. So having a robust organization is key. And that means we have a budget and we have a board of directors. So we're first going to receive the finance report from Mary Ellen, or Mary Ellen, are you from Mary
Yep.
Ellen? Right, and don't expect to be able to figure out all the details, but do listen as close as you can. Go ahead, Mary Ellen.
Am I on? Okay, great. Okay, let's try this. Yay, I believe you can see my screen. So thanks everyone. This is just a slide to put a final point on what a robust growth that Mass Peace Action has had recently, especially in these years of the pandemic. And as you've heard, we have quite a community led by our full-time staff, our organizer, Amar, our ED, Cole, Assistant Director, Brian, and our incredible, passionate, and talented interns that you've heard from. And in addition to them are scores of dedicated activists. And altogether, we have really produced a whirlwind of educational events and rallies, lobbying meetings. We've cranked out more work for peace than ever before. And as they say, there's no way we could do this without this generous support of our stalwart members and the MAPA peace community at large. It's been very, very gratifying. And last year, in fact, we exceeded our fundraising goal by $17,000. And it really tells us that you all and peace activists in Massachusetts really value the importance of our work, especially in these frankly unprecedented challenging times that we face. So we are committed to continue our development and to grow even more in the year ahead. Hold on a second. Let's see here. Oops. There we go. So I'm not gonna, I don't want you to get too dizzy with numbers. I'll just point out a few things to you. First of all, the Peace Action is in fact comprised of two organizations, Mass Peace Action, as well as Mass Peace Action Educational Fund, a 501c4 and 3 respectively. So I'm showing you a snapshot of our budget from 2021 and our proposed budget for 2022. And in particular, I'll just point out that each year, we have aimed for and achieved increases in our coffers. And so, for example, each year we aim for a 10% increase in income from fundraising, direct public support that I'm pointing out here. And again, we are proposing to do that for this year that we're in. And as far as our members, we really do encourage everyone to become sustainers and commit to supporting us on a regular basis, either monthly or quarterly. And then in particular, when it comes to setting up donations or your dues in general, we do encourage you to, or direct you rather, to those of you who don't rely on tax deductions to charitable institutions, which I imagine are most of us, that we do prefer donations to MAPA alone, where the money can be used for political purposes and candidate endorsements and campaigning. Otherwise, that wouldn't be possible. And I'd like to point out to you, so program income is, the dues are here in this yellow highlighted area. And I'm also pointing out this line here, which is what the amounts that we give to our interns. And indeed, we are projecting continued dramatic growth in our internship program. And as a result, MAPA has been steadily increasing the unfortunately still small stipends that we do pay them. And these are amounts that don't even come close to what they're worth. And you've certainly heard all about the work, the spectacular work that they've been doing, and that's really developing Mass Peace Action into a powerhouse peace organization more than ever before. So in particular, we are, projecting a 137% increase in the amounts, for our interns. And we are also likewise projecting an increase in our payroll expenses for our indefatigable staff and even our new part-time workers as well, our young workers who work part-time with us. So this is our budget. We are hoping for and aiming for a total expense of $242,000, an overall increase of 26%. And, we have a wonderful fundraising committee that is steering us through these waters. And we expect that we will continue to grow and hopefully continue to meet your expectations. So that's about it.
Thank you. I guess we have time for 1 or 2 questions, though it's a little hard with a complex spreadsheet, but see, I can't see hands up. Wait a minute.
Let's see, I don't see anything. I don't see anyone right now.
Right. I will say at next week's meeting, because we're going to be devoting some time about the actual political organizational choices and healthy organization. I mean, that's a place where we're going to have some discussion about finance and fundraising, right? So I'm going to assume that people are comfortable with this report as presented, and we'll kind of adopt it by unanimous consent, unless there are objections. Packy is in my view right now. She just spoke. I just want to pick up on how important that relationship is in Western Mass, right? The talent out there, diversity is extraordinary, and we are now a true statewide organization, and we're going to have some capacity that we didn't have before, and again, very, very broad political range. Now, let me talk about, we're going to go to the board elections. Because we are a real organization and not just 1,000 requests to send money, which is the membership model of many of our sister organizations, we have actually participation. And actually, we're not led by our staff. Our staff is led by the active members. That's why things work so well, because they understand and recognize the talent and the experience of the hundreds of volunteers. The board is important. We would love to have even a more diverse board than we have, but on the other hand, our board requires some actual work. We actually hold board meetings. The board makes decisions. Sometimes the board makes very difficult decisions. There's that difficult debates. You can imagine around the Ukraine situation, that was very difficult. So, but we have number of our members are stepping down, and we're gonna lose them after many years. And I should acknowledge that we're Carol Coakley, Eva Mosley, probably the longest standing member of the board, Andrea Burns, Jeff Napolitano. They're concluding their service. Not sure we're going to lose them because they'll stay with working groups. And we're going to start an advisory board. And Eva Mosley has kind of agreed to put some effort into that, because we have a circle of people who are interested in interacting with us, but don't have time to go to the working groups. And then we have a slate of new members. I don't know how many of you were able to read their bios, but I'm going to call on them to give a kind of 1-minute intro, at least 4 of them. Mary and Sarah, who led the Cuba effort, Hyatt Inman, Avery Johnson from Western Mass, and Alec Neely, who you heard from. Calla Walsh, who's a student, can't be with us. We're going to start off with Miriam.
We have a video from Calla, actually.
Oh, great. Miriam, introduce yourself to the crowd.
I'm Miriam Mansara. I'm Miriam Mansara, and I'm usually called Mary. And I'm actually talking to you from Havana. So I will be back in Western Massachusetts next week. I am delighted to work with Massachusetts Peace Action. And I am especially delighted that we're now going to be reaching hands across the state to Western Massachusetts. And indeed, I saw some people on this call who may be new to MAPA, but are not new to me. And I am delighted. I work in the Cuba subgroup, also the Ukraine committee. I long to work in 3 different other working groups because they're also terrific. And listening tonight, I thought I'd sign up for 5 more because they all sound so good.
Thank you. No, Mary's been a wonderful source of energy. Hyatt, make sure you unmute. Unmute.
Yeah, hello. Am I unmuted myself? Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I already sent a pretty complete introduction to everyone already, and it's mostly about my work and interest to the board. So for this round, I thought I would just share a little bit about who I am as a person. So from the time I was a child until today, the thing that upsets me the very most is injustice. In the geopolitical realm, what consistently brings out the Jedi in me are the shenanigans of the empire and its allies, whether it is in Palestine, Cuba, Venezuela, now Ukraine, or in the very targeted Muslim countries. In the social realm, I'm in a constant state of fury, probably all of you join me on that, on ongoing structural racism, bigoted behaviors of all sorts, and rampant economic inequality. Having said that, I'm pretty confident that Mass Peace Action board members will resonate with what I've just said and share many of my concerns. At a whole other level, I love to read, I love music, I love Western classical as well as ethnic music concerts, and I'm a hardcore Bruce Springsteen fan, although I've only attended 18 concerts. However, I did once chase after a concert all the way to Seattle. I like to eat good food, and therefore I love to cook. Anyway, let me end by thanking you all on MAPA board for your service. You are surely the reason Mass Peace Action is growing from strength to strength. And it would be an honor for me if I can make any contribution to Mass Peace Action. I appreciate being considered for a position on the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Avery, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Avery J. I live in Norwalk, which is now called Northampton, Massachusetts. As Packy was introducing, I've been a part of the Resistance Center for Peace and Justice, actually back starting when it was the Western Mass branch of AFSC this whole time. So I'm interested in continuing some of that work. We've been doing in the Valley, particularly with the internship program. We've had interns from several of the local colleges around here, and done a huge amount of great work. And I know it's inspired a lot of great activism. So I think it sounds like MAPA is starting out with internships too, and I think it would be interesting to see how that would work going forward. I've done, in addition to peace work, where I've been inspired by people like Francis Crowe, who started the AFSC branch, and so many other things, and other great legendaries we've lost, like Marty Nathan, who was talked about earlier. I've also been very involved with climate and racial justice in this part of the Commonwealth. And I do things like bike a lot all over the place. Ever have any questions about bikes? People ask me those a lot. I think that's enough about me.
Thank you. Well, welcome to the tribe. Alec.
Yeah, hi. You all heard from me a minute ago, but my name is Alec. I am a Northeastern University student pursuing international affairs and economics. I'm a former MAPA intern. And then since then, I have stayed on as a co-chair of the Legislative Political Committee, working with the interns, and now nominated for the board. So I'm quite pleased to be here. Outside of MAPA, I'm also on the board of directors of the international nonprofit, the Young World Federalists, as well as currently working full-time on another Northeastern co-op at a think tank based out of New York called the Governance Lab. And that's me. I'll keep it nice and quick.
Thank you. Okay, and I believe we have a video from Kala. Could someone put it up?
Yes, I'm going to cue that up. Here we go.
Hey everyone, this is Kala Walsh. I'm really sorry I can't be at the annual meeting, but
The sound is too soft. Let me try one more time.
I'm off to Cuba tomorrow on the May Day Brigade, so I'm recording this video in advance. I would be honored to have your vote to be on MAPA's executive board for the next 2 years. I think I would be the youngest board member, and that representation is really important to us as we are building a stronger intergenerational movement and bringing more young people and students into the work that we're doing. So I would be really excited about investing more in youth organizing as a board member, potentially running a series of youth targeted events or webinars in the fall to both do political education on anti-imperialism and peace activism, and also bring people into our on-the-ground work at MAPA. I also organize with BDS Boston and the Boston Cuba Solidarity Committee, July 26 org. So I hope to build more cross-movement solidarity between those groups, since those are issues that are also really important to MAPA. And I think the more united we are in our organizing, the more powerful impacts we can have. So I'd be really excited to work with you all on the board for the next 2 years. I will be going to college at McGill in Montreal, so I won't be in Massachusetts all of the year, but I'm confident that I would be able to stay really involved remotely, since so much of our work is already on Zoom. And I found it really engaging to build participation on Zoom and on social media and to reach people through these online channels. So yeah, I'm really excited to work with you all, and I hope to have your vote.
Thank you. Okay. So this is the group of new candidates that our executive committee, which sits as a nominating committee, is bringing before you. We also have a group of board members already elected previously, but who are willing to stand again. And we hope we include those in the slate. Their bios, their detailed bios are also on the website. I'm just going to briefly read the names for formality. Yoav, who you've heard from, Sheila Foreman, who you haven't heard from, Joseph Gerson, who you heard from very briefly, Keith Harvey from Cape Cod AFSC, Jared Hicks, Jackie King, me, your co-chair, Prasannan Parthasarathi from Newton, Steve Powell from Somerville, John Ratliff from Cambridge, Paul Shannon from who you heard from reporting on Middle East Group, and Michael Van Elzika. So these people, you've already elected them 2 years back. They've served faithfully and productively on the board. Now, let me say, it's not by policy that we don't have contested elections. We have nothing against, were there, a counter slate, we would run it. The fact of the matter is it's hard enough to get people to stand and agree to serve. And we don't have, opposition candidates, but it's in our bylaws. If if at the next election, if you're unhappy with the board, you can nominate, people on your own, and people can self-nominate. But right now, this group that's been put forward and named is the slate for the coming period. And I'm going to do it by acclamation, but we will count the noes and we will count the abstentions. So first, just raise your hand if you approve of this slate. Okay. All right. Brian, could you keep count?
Sure, let me switch it over to gallery view. Seeing a lot of hands.
Zoom very handily gives you a summation of who's doing what, and there are 19 hands raised right now.
Okay.
20.
Yeah.
And they're
21.
ones who are raising their physical hand at their virtual one, and that Zoom doesn't.
I see.
But yeah.
Opposed. So take down your hand if you voted for. Take down your hand. And let's have those opposed. If Brian, you would count the opposed.
Yeah.
No opposed. There are probably some abstentions. We usually have some abstentions, people who felt like they haven't had a chance to review the biographies. So feel free to abstain. It's okay. I don't see any. In that case, I'm happy to announce our new slate adopted unanimously. Okay, folks, that means you have a high burden on you to deliver on the trust of the group. And we will move forward with our new board. Now, next meeting. This is for the members of groups. This is the time to invite somebody to come next to the second part of the meeting, because those breakouts will be places where new people will be welcomed, can talk about how they can contribute, and we can work out our plans. But also the beginning of that meeting, we're going to review the political debate we've had about the emphasis on elections versus direct action, around the dealing with solidarity and support in the international arena, for example, Latin America, China, and also organizational needs like being able to reach out to young people, to make new people welcome, to broaden the base of the organization. And we'll have summaries of the discussions that Mary Ellen has led and the planning committee over the past month. I think many of you will find it pretty interesting the discussion, and productive and worth your time. Now on our agenda, that brings us to the adjournment. However, there may be issues. This is the annual meeting. There may be issues that some of you want to raise that weren't on the agenda. We won't necessarily resolve them, but we can hear them. So let me open up the floor for questions or comments or points or things you think need attention. For example, at the first board meeting after this meeting. let me go to gallery view. Okay. Don't see any. All right, in that case, we would, questions that come to your mind after the close of the meeting, next week will be the perfect time to raise anything on your mind. So do I hear a motion to adjourn? No, I don't hear a motion to adjourn.
No, we want to keep
There
going,
was
Jonathan.
something in the chat, Jonathan.
Oh,
Jonathan,
I
there was something in
see
the
there's
chat.
a hand raised,
hand up.
Robert.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, please speak.
Yes, I'm here this evening from New Orleans.
Oh, welcome.
I don't really know how I learned about you. Someone must have thought that I would be interested. And so I've been attending a number of the video meetings by Zoom. And when I saw a chance to attend a meeting, I jumped at it. I just want to tell you how impressed I am that you are so well organized. You act as though you could perhaps step into the government in DC and very possibly do a better job. But we are at the very beginning of organizing here in New Orleans, and I would like to hold up to my colleague here, your group, as what we can become. So thank you for letting me be here.
Well, thank you for contributing. Anytime you want to run a session, a Zoom session down there, a webinar, all our people speak for free, don't require any honorarium, and you can tell them only 5 minutes. You don't have to give them a half hour, even though they're coming from.
And it looks as though everybody follows the rule very well.
Right. So you raised a point. One of the things that I, as a co-chair, I've been dealing with is, people are very depressed about, the terrible situation in the world, the terrible situation in the Congress, the peace movement being in retreat. And I'm old enough to have lived through the McCarthy years. And I remember as a kid going down to the trial of Pete Seeger by the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was held in Brooklyn Court. I lived in Brooklyn. And Pete Seeger was being put over the coals because of his songs, right? And so he asked before the jury, he asked to be able to play. The judge wouldn't allow him to play. But, at that time, if you tried to express some call for world peace, right? I mean, you were just absolutely pilloried. And, it was terribly important that the Pete Seegers of the world and the peace movement of the time stayed together and didn't totally disintegrate, even though it shrunk and was able to come back and, turn out 1 million people in 1982. And we will, we are strengthening our roots, and we're not going to go away either, and we will bounce back. Two participants raised hands. I can't. Susan Mursky and Bruce Taub. Susan.
I just want to say, when each of us talked about our different groups and committees, what is most interesting in Mass Peace Action is how we integrate, how we work together and collaborate on issues and presentations, on actions. So although we seem separate tonight, we really do work together, and that's a great plus.
Great. Amen. Thank you, Susan. I see another hand, Bruce, but I don't see a face.
Thank you very, very much. I am new to MAPPA, though I've been a revolutionary for decades. I'm known to some of the people on the call. I want to counter the notion that these are simply terrifying and pessimistic times. These are optimistic times. These are transformative times. We are being led by our BIPOC brothers and sisters. We must remember that the land back movement and the anti-colonialism movement that has come to America is new. We have members in the Congress. We must continue to be optimistic, hopeful, and fight. People don't like to hear despair. I'm grateful to be among you. I'm complete.
Thank you. Well, no, certainly optimist we're full of them. All right. Are there other voices out there? 1 minute.
Motion to adjourn.
Right. Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor? Raise your hands.
Aye. Aye. Not debatable.
Okay.
Aye.
Sounds like it carries. And
Yeah,
thank you
great.
all, for really substantive meeting. And down there in New Orleans, man, we need you. We're happy to help. Right. So carry on. See many of you in